And it wasn't until after I finished it and was absolutely in love, that I found out, so sorry, there was like something in my throat. I think it was plagiarism. This is like the only book on this list that I have like mixed feelings about not recommending. I no longer am comfortable with the fact that a white woman wrote this book, and here's why. I'm still never gonna recommend the book. What up, my channel? Welcome back to another video. I'm Jessie, and you're watching What's up, y'all? Today I am bringing yet another video that is inevitably going to make me lose subscribers, and this is going to be my very first anti-book recommendations video where I talk about books that I do not recommend. Now, the reason that this video is going to ruffle a lot of feathers is because I'm going to be talking about my own personal set of ethics, and oftentimes when I speak about choices that I make for myself personally and what I do want to consume and don't want to consume, there's inevitably going to be people in the comments who are deeply offended by these choices that I'm making for myself. Personally, that just doesn't make any sense to me. Anytime you bring ethics into the act of reading, because that's something that a lot of us do for fun, people are inevitably going to get upset because a lot of people see reading books as like existing in a vacuum. It doesn't matter about the author, it doesn't matter their background, it doesn't matter what the author has done. And for me personally, that doesn't work. If that's the choice that you want to make for yourself, I would never try and discourage you from that, but you're also never going to discourage me from actually caring about things that the author has done, who the author is. Do they have the tools to actually tell somebody else's story? Do they have the right to tell somebody else's story? All of those things impact my experience as a reader and the lens that I'm able to read the book through. Personally, I come from a culture that has historically been exploited. Our stories have been taken from us and told by others for profit. And because of that, that is something that I'm never going to be comfortable with. And there are people who feel absolutely the opposite, even within my own community. And I think that that is valid. I think that people within a certain ethnic or social group are allowed to have conflicting opinions. It is through the enforcement of monolithic thinking that harm comes to our communities. Now, I know some people inevitably are going to say, okay, Jessie, well, you have a large following, and just because you're showing these books means that you're inherently recommending them. Personally, I wholeheartedly disagree with that, and here's why. Because I am a person of color as well as a queer and trans person, and I'm going to be talking about issues affecting BIPOC and trans people in this video. And as somebody who is of those groups, I absolutely have the right to talk about ethics impacting our communities. Growing up, I was expected not to talk about issues of queerness and blackness and Mexican identity, and that harmed me in a lot of ways. I promised myself a really long time ago that I was never going to allow anybody else to silence me. And so I thought it would be really, really important to come on here and actually talk about books that I did enjoy, but also because of my own ethical code, I don't recommend. And the reason that it's important for me to share this is because nuance matters. I want to show that yes, you can love a book and still know, hey, there's things about this book that is not okay. And because of that, I'm choosing per my ethics to not recommend it to others and instead recommend similar books that don't promote harm to various communities. Personally, I think that that is the more nuanced way, instead of pretending that those books don't exist, instead of pretending that I haven't read them, and instead of making me not have dialogue about them. I'm here because I like talking about books, whether you agree or disagree, but that's the whole point of my channel. I love talking about issues of politics as they impact reading. A lot of people don't like that. A lot of people see reading or as an apolitical experience, or they want reading to be apolitical. And that's just simply never going to be me. If that's how you choose to consume your books, there's nothing I can do about that, because I simply do not have the time, patience, energy, or concern to convince somebody else how to read their books. But I will tell you my perspective.
Then tell us, damn, why are you still talking?
Why is this introduction longer than the Wheel of Time series? Look at me trying to come up with something else to say. But I will tell you my perspective, and I will be down to have a conversation with you about it. So without further ado, let's get into the books.
Thank God.
Lay down. Good girl, good girl. Get up. Get up. Wow, I was today years old when I realized I do not have an actual copy of The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. I'm going to be showing off my copies of Hannibal and Red Dragon, which I actually got yesterday. This was sitting on the curb in a box of like used books. I had to pick it up because this is one of my favorite series. Now, I would be comfortable recommending Red Dragon and Hannibal, but I would never be comfortable recommending The Silence of the Lambs. If you are unfamiliar with what The Silence of the Lambs is about, it is a book that came out, I believe, in the 80s, and it is by critically acclaimed horror author Thomas Harris, and he gave us the serial killer known as Hannibal the Cannibal, Dr. Hannibal Lecter, who is this psychiatrist that works with the FBI and is found to be eating the shit out of people. He's imprisoned, and then he is like famously known for having consulted with the FBI on various cases, specifically through Clarice Starling, who is the female protagonist that we are following in The Silence of the Lambs. She is trying to bring a violent serial killer to justice, and his name is Buffalo Bill. He is known for skinning his victims, making suits out of them, and then wearing them. These books were all made into movies, in some cases multiple movies. They inspired the TV show Hannibal, which came out in 2013 by director Brian Fuller. It's my favorite TV show of all time, and that TV show is based off of Red Dragon. If you have been following me for 9 seconds, you know that I'm actually deeply obsessed with the Hannibal series. I am obsessed. God, I'm a sick fuck. I just got this Funko Pop in the mail, which is Dr. Hannibal Lecter. I have this cup, which I just got in the mail, which is Hannibal with his famous mask on, and you can actually drink out of it. And then I also got this Funko Pop that I've been wanting for years, but I am not comfortable recommending the film The Silence of the Lambs, despite the fact that, yeah, it's fucking amazing, and the book The Silence of the Lambs, specifically because of the way that it depicts trans femininity and trans womanness. Now, diehard Hannibal fans will say Buffalo Bill was even said within the text to not represent a trans woman, and that is correct, which is why for many years I was kind of like on the fence about defending this film for that reason. But at the end of the day, I think I forgot to say this earlier, but Buffalo Bill is largely considered to be a trans woman, and he skins women specifically and then puts on their skin suits, and wears makeup and gets all dressed up, and is presenting womanhood. And so a lot of people, diehard fans of the series, will be like, well, he's not supposed to represent transness. Lecter says he's not a trans woman. Trans women are already in society seen as predators. And J.K. Rowling recently came out with a book where the predator was a man who dressed up as a woman in order to prey upon women. And it furthers this narrative that trans women are dangerous, that trans women are creepy, that they are predators, that there's something weird and dark and twisted about the transness in and of itself. There is a really famous scene where Buffalo Bill takes his penis and like tucks it in and is dancing around. And the horror of the scene, especially if you watched it back in the day, the horror of the scene, it's about this man presenting as feminine. There are even parts where the audience is kind of made to feel cringy while watching him put on lipstick. And there's so many ways within the text and within the film that trans womanhood is villainized. Whether or not this character is intended to be trans or not is not the issue. So I have a psychology degree, and this series is one of the reasons why I went into psychology, is because of Dr. Hannibal Lecter, his own psychopathology, as well as the way that he breaks down others. And I don't care who you are, I don't care what you have to say, 90% of the serial killers that you see on TV are based off of Hannibal the Cannibal in some way, shape, or form. Before Hannibal the Cannibal, this idea of the intelligent psychopath was not widely circulated. And you have so many Hannibal the Cannibal ripoffs. The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. So sorry, there was like something in my throat. I think it was plagiarism. Just kidding, because I know a bunch of you are gonna get super, super upset. It wasn't actual plagiarism, but it was very fucking obvious that Dr. Edward Fosco, whatever the hell his name is, in The Maidens, was inspired by Hannibal Lecter. It's this idea of the well-refined, very, very intelligent, very highly manipulative serial killer who's charismatic. That came from Thomas Harris. Hannibal Lecter is the blueprint for almost all of the intelligent psychopaths that you see on TV. Everyone is trying to create the new Hannibal Lecter, and unfortunately, so many of these Hannibal mimicries don't live up to the legacy of Hannibal Lecter himself. Now, the rest of the books in this series, abso-fucking-lutely would highly recommend. I read this series when I was in elementary school and early middle school. Those of you who know my history with horror will not be surprised by that. So mind you, I did not have the analytical mind that I have now. I did not have the skills to dissect books from a sociocultural lens that I do not have now as an adult. There might be things within this text, and there probably are things within these texts that are problematic, and I do intend on doing a reread of this series at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later. But as of right now, nothing super harmful jumps out at me. But in terms of Silence of the Lambs, it is literally what got me into horror. My mother made me watch that with her when I was a kid, and it started this lifelong thing of watching horror movies with my mom, and to this day, like, we still geek out. But that being said, I'm still never gonna recommend the book. There are plenty of really awesome serial killer, dark serial killer, smart serial killer stories that don't depict transness in a harmful way that I choose to recommend instead. The next book that I have here is Let's Go Swimming on Doomsday by Natalie C. Anderson. This was one of the first books that I ever wrote a book review for on Goodreads, and I think I need to go back and look at that review and see if I've changed it or not, because I read this, I think, in 2018, and I have learned just so much since then. I think a lot of people who watch my channel assume that, like, I've never been problematic a day in my life, and that's so very far from the truth. There are ways in which I still to this very moment are problematic. Each of us are problematic in some way, shape, or form, and it's going to be a lifelong journey to work on the various ways that we can be better as human beings, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And so one of the things that I had to learn, and thankfully I learned as a result of joining the booktube community and learning exactly why these things weren't okay, was that I used to wholeheartedly recommend this book. A 16-year-old boy named Abdi who is kidnapped by terrorist group Al-Shabaab, and he is forced to be a child soldier, and then the CIA pulls him into a dark room and says, yo, like, if you spy on them for us, we will essentially grant you and your family asylum to move to America. And so we are following him after he has escaped from the terrorist group and now lives with a couple disabilities. And we're following him during his time as a child soldier and the awful things that he has done. And one of the things that I really loved about this book was the way that it explored morality and ethics and that murky line between good and bad. If you are kidnapped and forced to be a soldier, are you a bad person? If you are a victim of these institutions that are designed to oppress you and people like you, but you're trying to use that to your advantage to survive, what does that make you? As you can probably tell, I am obsessed with issues of morality and ethics. I spend a lot of time thinking about them. I care deeply about being an ethical person. And because of that, I examine myself under a microscope. I guarantee you, I analyze myself and my actions way harder than anyone else is ever capable of doing. Another thing that I really loved was that we get representation for a young Black boy living with very severe PTSD. And as somebody who is Black and lives with PTSD myself, that representation was so special to me, especially at a time where I hadn't read that before. I think this was like my first book that I can remember in recent memory. And that meant a whole hell of a lot to me. But also, we don't talk about traumatized Black boys, especially African boys. That mental health representation was so important to me. The other thing was how well it talked about grief and depression and regret. It was so raw and emotional and well written, and I really, really loved this book. And I remember in my Goodreads review I said, I was like, yeah, this book is written by a white author, but she is a woman who worked for 10 years for NGOs interviewing Somali refugees. And one of the perspectives in the book is of this woman who is taking, this white woman in that exact position, who is taking care of Abdi and trying to help him heal after he has escaped from this terrorist group. I personally wasn't uncomfortable with the story. I thought that she had something very important to offer given her experiences. She says within her author's note at the back, which this was also why I was comfortable recommending the book at the time. Lastly, a note on writing outside of my own perspective and community. This was not something I took on lightly, especially given the sensitive issues that are part of this story. I still have mixed feelings about putting this book out into the world. In particular, I have the utmost respect for religious freedom and in no way wish to add to the ridiculous misconception that Islam is a religion that promotes hate and violence. My aim in telling this story was to make stories and perspectives like the ones I heard while interviewing Somali refugees accessible to a wider audience. But with any story, it matters who does the telling. I realize that it is impossible to discount that I bring my own perspective and inherent biases. I had incredibly wise and patient people helping me along the way, And if there are any errors and missteps, they are entirely my own. And so for me, that was good enough to feel comfortable recommending the book. Since then, my opinion has changed. I have changed as a person and I have grown. And I no longer am comfortable with the fact that a white woman wrote this book. And here's why. Roxane Gay, who is an amazing social commentator, once tweeted, if an author has to explain and justify why they wrote a book, they probably shouldn't have written the book. And that's a really good way to sum this up. Even if it was perfectly done, and mind you, I'm not Somali, so it's not for me to say whether or not this was done well. Instead of recommending this book, which is by a white author, I can actually recommend a book by a Somali author, talking about the same exact experiences. So it just doesn't make sense. The other reason why I have realized that I do not have the right to recommend this story is that I am not Somali myself, and so I cannot say whether or not this was done well. If this was written by a white author representing a Black American experience, I as a Black American can pick up this book and say, yeah, this was written by a white author, and I personally didn't have any issues with it. But I cannot, as a Black American, pick up this book and say, I recommend this. I don't know if that makes any sense. Now, for a couple years, I tried really hard to find another YA book that was written by a Somali author depicting this kind of experience, and I just couldn't find one. I still to this day don't know about one because I would love to be able to recommend that book instead of this one. Do y'all have any recommendations for a story that is similar? Ideally, it would be young adult fiction, but if it isn't, that's cool too. Y'all will probably have already spied this book, and that is none other than The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. I have a reading vlog where I experimented with reading a few hyper popular romances and rating them. They were book talk popular romances specifically, and this was one of them. That video is going to be linked down below, and that was one of the hardest experiments I've ever had to do because you guys know that I hate romance. It shocked the hell out of me that I liked this romance. It shocked me for a few reasons. One, because it has that trope of like ginormous man and little woman, and on every single page you are reminded on how big this man is. I think his name is Adam, right? His name is Adam. And also of a man who just has very little to no personality, but women are fawning after anyway. It has a lot of tropes that I don't like, but for some reason the story really worked for me. I really love books about women in STEM, and I loved the representation for working in a lab. I worked in a lab in undergrad, and I will always cherish that time. And the representation was just so spot on. There was something about the romance that made my heart flutter, and it had nothing to do with like Adam's size and his description, but it was just the feeling their dynamic evoked. I actually cared about the sex scenes, which is really weird. And I think a big part of the reason why I loved this book so much was because I related a lot to Olive, our demisexual protagonist. And if you want to hear more about like my experience reading this book in real time, definitely check out that vlog. Long story short, I really loved this book, and it shocked the absolute hell out of me. It is the only romance book that I have ever read that made me like geek out as hard as I did. I was whole ass flustered. I was like embarrassed while reading it. Like this and Milk Fed by Melissa Broder are the two romances that had me. And of course it's hilarious because I have not enjoyed one of this author's books since. But moving on. The reason why I cannot ethically recommend this book is because in the comment section of that video, a lot of you let me know that this is based off of an abusive relationship, specifically the relationship between Kylo and Ren from Star Wars. This is the only book on this list that I have like mixed feelings about not recommending, and here's why. I have not watched any of the Star Wars movies. It is a shock that I even know the names Kylo and Ren, and I really only know their names because of you guys talking in the comment section about the fact that it's upsetting to you that this book is based off of an abusive relationship and that I'm recommending it. And a lot of you were telling me that I should look into it, and when I started looking into it, I just got exhausted because it involved this giant fandom that I don't give a shit about. In order to really understand the dynamics present, I would have had to watch the source material, and I'm not fucking watching Star Wars. I'm just not doing it. I don't care. I don't care. I'm never gonna care. So the reason why I have mixed feelings is because I'm literally going off of somebody else's opinion of what is and what isn't an abusive relationship. That being said, I firmly believe in believing people. And I'm gonna believe you if you say, hey, this representation hurt me. This was based off of a relationship that harms me, that made me feel unsafe. That is something I will always listen to. And if multiple people are going to say that, then yes, I'm going to listen to it, even if I don't know the whole story myself. And I know that that is going to be something that ruffles a lot of your feathers, because there's a lot of people who are like, nope, watch the movie for yourself, make up entirely your own opinion. And I get that. A lot of you are like that, and cool, good for you. For me personally, I believe in believing members of my community. And I'm going to believe you if you say like, hey, it's based off of a relationship that hurt. And if this was a book like by an indie author, for example, or a small BIPOC author, I would take the time to like really look into all of the situations, like all of the dynamics present. But this is an author who is wealthy as fuck. This book is everywhere. So me not recommending The Love Hypothesis is not going to hurt the book in any way. Still gonna be rich, still gonna be coming out with all these special editions. The book is going to be fucking fine. So considering who the author is, that's the other reason why I don't care to look into it. Considering the amount of power that this author has in the literary and in the romance community, I'm not all that concerned with not recommending it. Also, everybody and their mama is recommending this book, so I really don't need to anyway. Next up, we have Hostage of Empire series. This was written by S.C. Emmett, and the first book is called The Throne of the Five Winds. Now, the experience of even encountering and selecting this book is always going to be a really tender one. There was this bookstore called Hugo's Mystery Books, and it had been around for ever and ever and ever, and it was a bookstore dedicated exclusively to mystery, science fiction, and fantasy books. It was a famous bookstore. It was a bookstore I really cherished, and the first time that I ever met Starla of Starla Enjoys, we went to this bookstore and I purchased this book, and we took photos there. And unfortunately, the bookstore no longer exists. It was burned down during the uprising. And I just remember the experience of being in that store and feeling so safe and loved. And there was like a store dog. Everything about that memory I cherish. I don't talk about it often, but I do suffer with really severe memory loss. So it is very, very rare that I have a wildly clear memory like that. And so that's another reason why I cherish it. So then getting into the actual book. In The Throne of Five Winds, a princess is sold into her enemies' empire in order to broker a tenuous peace between their two peoples. But life within the palace is, of course, not what it seems. There are unknown dangers lurking around every corner. There are assassins, and there are 6 princes, each with their own schemes, 5 of them for the throne itself. We are also following 2 queens who are very... one of them in particular is brutal and bloodthirsty. That bitch don't play, okay? It is such a vibrant cast of characters, and the writing is phenomenal. We are also getting to follow Yala, who is the princess's lady-in-waiting, and she's secretly a badass bitch, and she's really, really freaking smart, and she's just thwarting assassinations left and right. She is so cool. This world is just vibrant, and what really shines in this book, especially book 1, is the characters. The character work is exquisite. It is slow, it is well paced, it is measured, and it is painstaking. And this is an East Asian inspired fantasy. There were just these really little aspects to serving tea and to mannerisms and courtesies. Oh shit, what is the word for the rules for how to behave? There's a word for that. Manners? Whatever. And they were so painstakingly given, and it just really made everything come to life, such as the angle that your sleeve is dangling when pouring tea. Things like that, little details, and I thought that that was so freaking cool. And it wasn't until after I finished it and was absolutely in love that I found out that the author was white. If you read this book, you will see what I mean. It is painstakingly inspired by East Asia. Not only are the characters Asian, but so much of East Asian culture and customs have been, I don't want to say taken because I don't know what is inspired and what is actual. It leans very heavily. And there are so many fantasies by East Asian authors that you can recommend instead. The sequel, The Poison Prince, was on my wish list, and it was sent to me, and I read it, and I loved this one as well. And I fully intend on continuing with this series, but I will not talk about them on Goodreads. I will not rate them. I will not be recommending them. I just want to make sure that I'm not recommending these books like in any way, shape, or form. But yeah, I did absolutely love them. And despite the fact that I love them, I'm not recommending them because they were not written by an Asian author. And currently I am reading 3 spectacular fantasies by Asian authors. I have so many of those books on my shelves. There are so many of those books in bookstores. So there really is no reason to read this over any of those books. And finally, the last anti-book recommendation that I'm going to be giving is The Roses of May by Dot Hutchison. Now, if you've been following me on Instagram, you know that I am utterly and absolutely obsessed with The Butterfly Garden. I made an Instagram reel about it. I've been raving about it, and I also talked about it in my September wrap-up, which I will leave linked down below. This is a part of a 4-book series, and the second book follows an entirely different girl, an entirely different serial killer, but that case is still being investigated by the original investigators from The Butterfly Garden. Did I love this book as much as The Butterfly Garden? Absolutely not, because nothing could ever top that book. It was so creepy and unsettling and disturbing and sick. The designing of the gardener, who's the name of the serial killer, was so clever and intelligent and well crafted. The character work done on him was spot on. I just absolutely loved everything about The Butterfly Garden. I loved the horror. I loved the victim forward storytelling. I loved the psychological distress that it put the reader in on every single page. I loved the pacing. I loved that Dot knew exactly when to switch POVs to leave you wanting more, and the way that she used multiple characters to tell this story. The audiobook was also utterly phenomenal, so I could not wait to read the sequel, which is The Roses of May. In this book, we are following Priya, who comes from an Indian family, and the author is white. Priya's older sister, Chavi, was murdered by a serial killer 5 years ago, and that killer is now after Priya, and what he does is he slashes a girl's throat and leaves flowers on her corpse in a church. It had so many of the elements that I loved from The Butterfly Garden, but it really does lean into this being a family of color. And so if somebody is of Asian descent and wants to read this book and say, yeah, I feel like I recommend this or don't recommend this, I feel like that's their right to do so. But for me, not being of Asian descent, not being Indian, I do not feel I have the right to recommend this book. There could be something very harmful and stereotypical about the representation that I'm not aware of because it's not my culture. Again, and 9 times out of 10 for my own personal set of ethics, I don't recommend books where white people are writing protagonists of color. This is something that I have really mixed feelings on because there are some books that I recommend where this happens, but for the absolute most part, it is something that I just like to steer clear of. Now, there are a lot of books that I do recommend where white authors are writing side characters that are people of color. The only time I usually have a problem with that is if the representation is harmful. Overall though, I like to get my BIPOC representation from the source. A lot of people have commented and said, well, you know, don't you want white authors to include people of color in their stories? And here's the thing, I'm not looking to white people to represent experiences of people of color. I'm just not. Y'all can do that if you want to, but I'm not doing it. And if a white author wants to write an all-white story, I have no problem with that. When people are criticizing white people for not writing characters of color, I'm like, okay, but be careful what you wish for. And there are people of color who are like, no, I want white people to write us into their stories. That's important to me. They're allowed to have that opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. Each of us individually has to decide what we are and aren't comfortable with. And where I'm at as an individual, it's just not something that I'm comfortable with. So that's all I'm going to say about that book, just because the things that I have to say would be redundant at this point in the video. I feel like you all get what I'm saying. So I would love to have a nuanced discussion in the comment section down below. What are some books that you enjoyed that you don't recommend per your own set of ethics? If you want more content from me, I do have a Patreon where I make exclusive content for my patrons. This month's exclusive video was fall book recommendations, autumnal book recs. I also recently did a video where I give the nitty and the gritty on the book that I am writing, which I am only sharing details with my patrons throughout the writing process. Our September buddy read is none other than The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, for which I am filming a spoiler-filled reading vlog for. But click on the link down below to check out my Patreon for yourself. Stay safe, be good to yourselves, be good to others, and I can't wait to see you in my next video.